Alright, so I am back, and unfortunately, the NFL season is almost done. And with every NFL season that ends, the beginning of the coaching carousel starts. And this year might be one of the biggest coach carousels that we've seen in quite some time, as currently I have 7 guys who are definitely, or at least very likely, going to be replaced, and 2 other guys who might get replaced. And with 10 plus assistant coaches potentially getting hired to become the new head coach of some franchise, in today's video, I want to talk about the 7 people who are going to potentially get fired and who might replace those guys. So without further ado, let's hop right into it. And I think the best way to start this video off is just by talking about the 10 candidates that I currently have written down, but I do think there's a couple more you could potentially throw in there. The 10 candidates I have are Ben Johnson, Brian Flores, Dan Quinn, Jim Schwartz, Raheem Morris, Steve Spagnuolo, Jim Harbaugh, Bobby Slowick, Mike McDonald, and Eric Bieniemy. All of the names that I showed out today are simply just offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators. I don't believe any assistant coordinators that are not offensive or defensive coordinators will get the position of head coach at any organization. I've heard some people say Gerard Mayo would make a good head coach, and I definitely do think he can be, but I just don't think it's going to happen this year. And the fun part about all this is that there's a good combination of ex-head coaches who are looking for their next head coaching job, guys like Brian Flores and Dan Quinn, whereas there's also a good mix of coordinators who are going to be going for their first head coaching gig, guys like Brian Johnson, Raheem Morris, and Mike McDonald. So it really is pick your poison. Which one do you want? Do you want somebody who's going to be an experienced head coach who might not have the upside of somebody like a Ben Johnson, or do you want a unproven yet potential filled coaching option, like I said, Ben Johnson or Bobby Slowick? I do think that's going to come down to just what the organization wants. A lot of Chargers fans want an established head coach, whereas a team like the New England Patriots might want a younger, unproven coach who could potentially become the next Bill Belichick. But let's actually start talking about the guys who are going to get fired, and we're going to start off with Arthur Smith, the current head coach for the Atlanta Falcons. I think it is a matter of time until he eventually gets replaced. Atlanta Falcons are calling for his job, and this guy just lost to the fucking Carolina Panthers, so I don't see a world in which he keeps his job. And it's hard to say what Atlanta wants. I could definitely see them going down the route of getting an experienced guy like a Jim Harbaugh, or maybe getting a guy who might be a little bit more youthful and can bring in some different energy, a guy like Bobby Slowick or Ben Johnson. As for who I do think they'll pick up, I don't see it being a younger guy. I definitely do think they're going to go down the route of getting an experienced guy. I think for Atlanta, the number one guy who I think makes the most sense would be Eric Bieniemy. Obviously, he's been around guys like Patrick Mahomes and this year Sam Howell. And I know the Sam Howell experiment really didn't go well for Washington. I still think that offense was pretty respectable with Eric Bieniemy leading the way. And more than likely, the Atlanta Falcons are going to be drafting their future quarterback. So if they get a guy like Eric Bieniemy to train a young quarterback like Michael Penix or Bo Nix, I definitely do think that could be a very nice pairing. If they do decide to go down the offensive coordinator route, then another guy they could potentially get would be Jim Harbaugh. That one is a bit more interesting because this is a guy who is currently with Michigan and hasn't been an NFL coach for quite some time. So while I would rather have Eric Bieniemy, I definitely do think Jim Harbaugh would be a good candidate here as well. And if they do get Jim Harbaugh, keep an eye out for JJ McCarthy in the draft because that combination there at Michigan has been pretty solid. The next guy who is basically a guarantee to get fired or let go is, of course, Bill Belichick, the current head coach for the New England Patriots. And as I mentioned earlier, I do not see Bill Belichick getting replaced by an established head coach like a Dan Quinn or Brian Flores. I definitely do think it's going to be a younger guy who's a little bit less proven. I think the number one name right now who I think would make perfect sense would be either Ben Johnson, Bobby Slowick, or Mike McDonald. And because the defense really is not the problem for this Patriots team, I definitely do think they should go for an offensive guy, and I think the best name here would be Bobby Slowick. He is the current offensive coordinator for the Houston Texans and has been a absolutely big reason why that team has been able to turn it around. He has a background with the 49ers and now with CJ Stroud. If you give him a young quarterback to work with down there in New England, I definitely do think he could work some magic. That is a Patriots team that has not had a good offense in quite some time, basically ever since Mac Jones' rookie year, and even then the offense was just kind of average. So essentially in one offseason, you're going to get your future quarterback in either Caleb Williams or Drake May, and then your future offensive coordinator slash head coach in Bobby Slowick. And I think in one offseason that could be a huge deal for them moving forward. But next up, our next position that's definitely going to be getting replaced is the current spot for the Carolina Panthers, which is currently being held by Chris Tabor, the current interim head coach. And no disrespect to Chris Tabor, but he hasn't really done anything much more special than what Frank Reich was able to do. I will give him some credit though, he has gotten a couple W's, so shout out to Chris Tabor. If he's not going to be a head coach, he's definitely going to get another job somewhere else to be at least another assistant or co-offensive coordinator, so on and so forth. As for who this team should get, I think the answer is very obvious. It almost has to be Ben Johnson. You're going to get a guy who took Jared Goff and turned him into a top 10 level quarterback, and I definitely do think he could do the same thing for a guy like Bryce Young. And I think for Ben Johnson, this job might be a little bit tempting because you already have your future franchise quarterback. And with his style of liking to run the ball a ton, he is definitely going to have to establish some new schemes along the offensive line, as well as get some new personnel to fix the offensive line problems. I think if the owner promises that he's going to have 3 to 4 years to establish what he wants to do, and he's not going to mess and fiddle around with the draft and all this and that, I definitely do think Ben Johnson would be absolutely ecstatic to take the job. And if you're the owner for the Panthers, you're going to have to pay up a fortune to get this guy because there's going going to be a lot of suitors for this guy. But I think if you give Ben Johnson, Bryce Young, and you fix the issues along the offensive line, I definitely do think this team can potentially turn things around. Just unfortunately, they don't have their first round pick this year, but I think you have to kind of convince Ben Johnson with some other factors. The next coaching position that has to be filled is, of course, the Los Angeles Chargers job, which is currently being held by Giff Smith. And again, Giff Smith has just not been doing a very good job. He is most definitely going to get replaced. As for who I think he should get replaced by, I made a video talking about this, and a lot of people said Jim Harbaugh. I made the video on this, and I said personally that I would like to see Dan Quinn or Ben Johnson get the job, and I still stand by that, but I could definitely see Jim Harbaugh getting the job here. It seems to me that Chargers fans want to get an established guy, and Jim Harbaugh being that established guy makes a ton of sense. The other guy who I think makes a ton of sense, and I mentioned him in the video, was of course Dan Quinn. Now, whether or not Dan Quinn wants to actually leave Dallas to go to a team like the LA Chargers, I don't know. From everything that I've heard, I don't think he's going to leave Dallas anytime soon. It seems to be like he likes the job over there. So if that is the case, I definitely do think they should go for a more experienced guy like a Jim Harbaugh or even a guy like Jim Schwartz. Again, for me, I don't really think the offense is that big of a problem. I think once they get Herbert back and they get healthy along the offensive line and get some receivers back, they're going to be just fine. I think this is a defense that has to get fixed first. That's why I'm a big fan of getting a defensive coordinator for this team, but I definitely can't see what Chargers fans are saying with getting a guy like Jim Harbaugh. Next up, we have the Washington Commanders position, which is currently being held by Ron Rivera, who was basically a ticking time bomb of when he's going to get fired. Shout out to Riverboat Ron. He is one of the most likable head coaches in the entire NFL. It just so happens that he is not the fit down there with the Commanders. And yet again, the Commanders are kind of in an interesting position. I imagine they're definitely going to go down the route of getting a younger, less experienced guy, because with Ron Rivera being that experienced head coach who was once the head coach of the Carolina Panthers, I think this is a team that kind of needs a new, fresh start. And I think the Washington Commanders job could definitely be pretty enticing. At the end of the day, you have a top 3 pick, which is more than likely going to go towards a quarterback, and overall, your roster is pretty talented. You have some good defensive pieces. You just drafted Emmanuel Forbes last year, and offensively, you have good players like Terry McLaurin and Brian Robinson. So I think this would definitely be a tempting job for a lot of people. I think the one thing that most people don't want to deal with this job is kind of the stigma that Washington has right now. It feels like Washington has been a toxic place for many years to come, and while there's new ownership now, I do think things are getting better. I definitely think that is kind of a bit of a stigma that might be holding some coaches back. As for who I think this team should go for, I definitely do think it should be an offensive guy, and yet again, I'm going to go back to 2 people, and those guys are Ben Johnson and Bobby Slowick. Offensively, this team was kind of a mess this year with turnovers and just not playing up to their potential. And I think getting a younger, less experienced guy who can come in there and just really turn things around would make a ton of sense. But if this team wants to go down the defensive route, which I can also see very much happening, I definitely do think Raheem Morris would make a ton of sense here. Morris makes the most sense for a guy who's going to come in and just instantly change the culture around there. So would a guy like Mike McDonald. They would instantly change things. They would also make the defense a ton better as well. I definitely do think Washington has a lot of open candidates who they can select from. And the last name that I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about is Dennis Allen, the current head coach for the New Orleans Saints. I understand this is a guy who's a defensive-minded guy, and the Saints have a pretty solid defense, but overall, this team is just a total mess when it comes from start to finish. And while I don't think this is a very tempting job for many head coaches, I definitely do think there are some coordinators who would definitely like to take on the challenge. And I think this team might want to keep going with the tradition of going with defensive-minded guys. I do think Dennis Allen has done a decent job with the defense, but I think a guy like Steve Spagnuolo, Brian Flores, Dan Quinn, or Jim Schwartz could definitely come in and do a better job. I think Dennis as a coordinator is totally fine, but him in terms of roster building has not been very good. This team's salary cap situation is a total mess, and overall they just haven't really been great at drafting, especially later in the draft. So if you think that a guy like Jim Schwartz or Steve Spagnuolo can actually do that, I definitely do think they should be the leading candidates there. Will he get fired? Probably not. It seems like the Saints are pretty content with him, but do I think he should be? 100%. And I have 2 more names who I think might be on the hot seat if they have another bad year next year, and that is Mike Vrabel and Mike Tomlin. And I'll even throw one other name out there if he has a bad playoff run, and that's Mike McCarthy. I love Big Mike, but at the end of the day, his coaching sometimes can be a little bit questionable. And even though Dallas has been successful under Mike McCarthy, I wonder how much of it is because of him and how much of it is because of the talent that's already there. As it goes for Mike Vrabel, I think that he has plenty of time to prove himself. It seems like Titans fans are constantly calling for his job, and even though I think it's a little bit harsh for them, he definitely does have to prove himself next year. But me personally, I am willing to hear out Mike Vrabel to see if he can fix this offensive line next year. I think Mike Vrabel with a good offensive line, a young quarterback, and some good receiving weapons is definitely pretty interesting. So unless they have a horrible year next year, then I don't think he's going to get fired this year. Whereas I think Mike Tomlin could definitely be on the hot seat this summer. Similar to Mike Vrabel, I've been hearing a lot of Steelers fans call for his job. And while Tomlin obviously has a track record of being able to win a Super Bowl and being able to have multiple winning seasons, when it comes to his recent success, it really has not been all there. He hasn't really had a deep playoff run since Big Ben. But because I don't believe in Kenny Pickett, Mason Rudolph, any of the quarterbacks they've had, I do think he should get one more year with a young rookie quarterback. And I think you just have to wait and see if he can continue to be the guy with a young rookie quarterback. But that's just my 2 cents on this coaching carousel we're about to have. Obviously, we're going to have plenty of content this summer regarding the coaching decisions that are made. So if you did enjoy this video and you want to see more content from me, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button while you're here. And let me know in the comment section below if you guys agree with all the coaching decisions that I put out. At the end of the day, it is just my opinion. So let me know in the comment section below. But I love you guys. Peace.